testing period. And the point of this test is that you no longer are in the state of being a student of this material. Now you're absorbed, you reach that level. Avraham Avinu is going through 10 tests, which means 10 different levels of enormous growth. Each one was a very deep challenge to Avraham, and having gone through this put Avraham in a different level. As we discussed last week, that among the tests was when Hashem told Avraham, leave your home, leave your land, your father's home, and break away and go on your own. This was a big test we discussed last week. And then there was the test of Milah. He was given the mitzvah of Milah. This week there are several of these, and ultimately the most significant and the most difficult, the most impossible of all the tests came also in this week's Parsha. First there was when Yitzchak was born. So Sarah noticed that Ishmael is not a good friend for Yitzchak. Ishmael is not a good partner for Yitzchak to grow up the way Yitzchak is supposed to grow up. Ishmael was 14 years older than Yitzchak. And all these years he grew up in Avram's house. But this is not the same caliber and the same purity as Yitzchak. And Sarah said, it's impossible for Yitzchak to grow together with Ishmael. And Sarah said to Avram, he should take his son Ishmael and send him out of the house. And the Torah tells us that this was a very difficult thing for Avram. He was pained to do that. Says that he was very much in pain to do that. This was a test. In what sense was this test? Avram longed, desired all his life to have a son, Yitzchak. And his longing for a son was not the normal, natural desire to have a child like everybody wants to have their own child. Avram dedicated his life in establishing Hashem's presence in the world, and he was longing for a son who would inherit and take over his activities, and then it would be perpetuated, be made forever, established forever by his children. Without that, all his effort will just have been a nice thought, a nice exercise, but it won't be anything real, because there was not a real basis for it to last. You learned in the previous parsha when Avram left his father's home, it says Avram went, and Lot went along with him, and also HaNefesh Asher Osu B'Chorah, the souls which they acquired in Chorah. What are these souls? Rashi says that they both, Avram and Sarah, were both involved in bringing people to Hashem, to teach people about Hashem. They were all souls that they made them their students. They had a big academy. Yes, sir.
What happened to
them?
Where
That's a good question. That's exactly the question that I'm pointing out. No, that's the point which I'm trying to make. Yes, they all learned about it, and they became Avram's followers, but then it all dissipated. It all fell back to their original nations. It wasn't completely lost, because nothing is lost completely. If somebody learns about something, even if he forgets it later, something remains with him. And something goes over to his children and so forth. Everything that happened in the world, in terms of refining the world, has a lasting effect. And as we see now, that after these thousands of years, the world is much more open to godliness and to understanding Torah and so forth. This is because of all thousands of years of effort. So nothing is lost, but nevertheless, he did not establish a base, a nation that would carry Avram's banner through all the years, to forever. Yitzchak was this hope of Avram, that he will have a son who will take over and who will carry on his activities and his way of life. And therefore, when Yishmael was considered to be a hindrance to Yitzchak's development, Yitzchak's spiritual growth, despite the fact that this is Avram's son, and Avram loved him also, in general, Avram was a person of chesed, of love, and to send his son away was a very, very painful thing. Nevertheless, this is part of Avram's dedication to the service of Hashem. He has to establish Yitzchak in a pure way, and even Yishmael cannot be allowed to interfere with it. And therefore, Avram had to go and send Yishmael out of his house. Hashem promised him that he will watch him, and that he will be safe, he'll grow up, and he'll be a big nation. Nevertheless, this was a big test for Avram. Because of his great dedication to this task, he did it. And then, at the finale, at the very end, Hashem tells Avram, take this very Yitzchak, the one that you're building on, that you have put so much hope on, to be carrying on your task. Take him and put him on the altar. This, I want to discuss this from various angles. We all know that this directive from Hashem to put Yitzchak on the altar, the Akedah, is something which is completely beyond human understanding. From every angle. In general, how do you take a human being, put him on the altar? This is not Avram's thing. And then, your own son. And on top of that, who told him to do this? Hashem. Hashem, Avraham had had dedicated his life to serving Hashem. And then this Rebbeinu Shalom that he is serving is telling him to do such a wild thing. What's going on? What would be a normal reaction to this type of statement? Hashem tells Avram, take your son, put him on the altar. What would be a normal reaction? What you say? Did you mean it? Did I hear you right? Is that you talking? Or is this a sound from just an echo from someplace? Is this real? Right? Did you lose your mind? I mean, what's going on? In other words, Hashem, we do not see Hashem. We see the world, we don't see Hashem. We understand, we believe, we recognize His presence through the greatness of the world and the greatness of His deeds, but we don't see Him directly. So if you don't see Him directly, and a voice comes to you from Hashem and tells you to do such a thing, the first thing would be you would doubt this voice. You would question yourself, is this for real? And if this were real, then you would question, what happened over here? Like I said, do you really mean it? Did you? The Gemara tells us there's a whole sefer in Tanakh. It's called E Vayeyroh. In English, it's called Job. I don't know if you're familiar with E Vayeyroh. E Vayeyroh, the Tanakh says that he was a ish yoshor, or something. He was a very fine and upright person, and his Yirei Elokim, he served God. And then the Satan came, and the Satan made Hashem, convinced Hashem that he should test Eve. And what was the test for Eve? He put Eve into very, very difficult situations. First, all his property, he was a very wealthy man, all his property was burnt up. And then his whole family was destroyed. And then finally, Eve himself became sick with leprosy. He was in total pain. And this whole Tanakh deals with this discussion between Eve and his friends, all kinds of different gives and takes. So one of the things that Eve said in the Gemara explains what Eve was saying. Eve said, Rebbeinu Shalom, perhaps a big storm, Ruach Se'ora, a big storm passed by, and it distorted. Distorted means it confused the reading. Instead of Eyov, you read Oyev. Oyev means enemy. My name is Eyev, not Oyev. Perhaps you made a mistake. You look at my name and you thought it's written Oyev, and I'm not Oyev, I'm Eyev. In other words, when things happen, and as the Gemara said, the Tanakh says that Eyev was a very good man, a great man. He was the greatest amongst his peers in everything. He was the best. He always gave charity and was very successful. But when a person sees from Hashem such things that he cannot make sense at all, everything looks upside down, he says, "Hey, Ben Shalom, maybe you lost your mind. Maybe something confused you." And this was one of the debates between Eev and his friends, where they reprimanded him for saying this kind of thing. So this would be, so to speak, a natural reaction, a normal reaction. Avraham, he didn't doubt 1 second. 1 second. Is it true? Hashem said, no question about it. And he immediately got up. Vayashkem Avraham Babeker, immediately got up, prepared himself for the trip. Didn't have to think it over. Is it true? Is it real? Am I supposed to do it? Or am I just supposed to think it? He goes and he follows through and he goes on the trip. So, as a first step, what this tells us, and it's very important for us to reflect on this. This parsha begins with the word Vayeyroh. Vayeyroh Elav Hashem. Hashem appeared to him. In the previous parsha, it says, Dvar Hashem Vayid Yehoyah Dvar Hashem Lavrom B'machaseh. Avram had Hashem's word come to him B'machaseh. What is machazeh? Machazeh is the Aramaic word for mara. Aramaic for seeing. Chozi is Aramaic. So the Rebbe explains the difference between when you use the word re'iyo, the way it is in Lashon HaKodesh, and machazeh, the way you use it in Aramaic. The difference is that when you use the word re'iyo, it means that the sight is clear, without a iota of doubt. No camouflage, no hiding, clear. Machazeh means that you see it, but it's not so purely clear. It's translated in Aramaic. So up until the time that Abraham had the Bris Milah, he had the level of Machazeh. After Bris Milah, he actually saw Hashem clearly. There was no doubt. And we could see from this episode that Avraham was told to take Yitzchak and put him on the altar, and he had no doubt at all, and he didn't question. One thing that it shows us right away is that it was an Re'iyo. There was not a sight that you see through some kind of indicators. And we have some kind of signs, proofs. You have to figure out, am I really seeing it or not? No question whatsoever. Re'iyo, he saw. Before we go into the Akedah itself and what was intended for it, just to focus in on this, just to this one point. It is important for us to understand that even though we are in the physical world, and the physical world is what we see clearly, spirituality, we understand in our seichel. We don't. It's not clear. It's something which we know through our intellect. And anything that we know through our intellect, we always have a question: do I understand it correctly? Is it this way or is it that way? nevertheless, there is still the possibility, we still have the capability, even in our state, to see and recognize the truth, the godly truth, to the point where there's absolutely no doubt. Total clarity. There's a story with the Tzemach Tzedek, where a Chosid came to Tzemach Tzedek, and he was crying to Tzemach Tzedek. He was very broken. And he said, Rebbe, help me. I'm having doubts, questions about Hashem. I'm having doubts about Hashem. It's a painful thing. Something is kind of confusing me in my mind. So Tzemach Tzedek said to him, tell me, are you sure there is a Tsar in Petersburg? You know the Tsar in Petersburg? Tsar, the king. Are you sure? The king in Petersburg. Are you sure there is a Tsar in Petersburg? He says, yes. He says, did you ever see him? No. So how are you so sure that there is a Tsar in Petersburg? So he says, well, I saw people that saw him. People came back and they told me they saw the Tsar. So Tzemach Tzedek says, you can trust me. I saw him. You can alleviate your doubts.
So it's good enough to trust the fact that there's a Rebbe. That's how we know there's a Shem, or we shouldn't just look at it that way.
No. What I'm saying is, the point which I'm trying to bring out is that even in this physical world, yeah, sure, you have to learn from Tzemach Tzedek, but ultimately we have the capacity, we have the faculties and the insights and the capability to focus in and to see and recognize the presence of God as clearly as sight. Except that it has to be purified in one's own mind. You have to work to clear your mind. But it is a possibility to the point where one can attest with surety. You can trust me, I've seen it. So that knowledge of Hashem, this is my point, that knowledge of Hashem is not an imaginary Shalom thing or something that we believe at a distance. I was told to believe it and I believe it. This is something which is personal. Each one of us can have a personal understanding and personal recognition of this truth. Of course, each one in their own level, in their own depth level and so forth, but still everyone can have that insight. This is what's called in Chassidus, that in the Koyches HaNefesh, in our faculties, there is a Chochmah and Bina. And Chochmah, the level of Chochmah, is also called Re'iyah, sight. Re'iyah the Seichel, which is like sighting. And in Chochmah, a person can have such a clarity, such a clear perspective, like he sees it. Going further, discussing this Akedah episode, Avram then went and he took Yitzchok, and Yitzchok, as we said before, Yitzchok was not just a son like anybody else. Yitzchok to Avram was the basis for perpetuating, for continuing on in his work, in his life's work, of bringing Hashem to the world. And he is taking Yitzchok, which means all his lifelong effort putting him on the altar. How did he do it? So this is called Mesiras Nefesh, obviously. This is the greatest level of Mesiras Nefesh that ever was. This was when Avram put Yitzchak on the Akedah. I want to go a little bit to a more meaningful perspective on this. Sure, Hashem can test Avram, take your son and put him on the Akedah. But what is the significance of this? What's the point? The avodah of Abraham throughout his lifetime to bring Hashem into the world was not merely, so to speak, to elevate the people of his time, to elevate them from out of a state of Avodah Zorah, to lift them up a little bit to an intelligent state. The point there was to bring about a complete connection and unity between Hashem and the world, so that the whole metzius of the world, the physical world itself, will be recognized as being, and not just we live properly and decently in the world, but that the physical world itself will be recognized as a godly world. This is what it says about Abraham in one of the psukim that you learn, Vayikro Shom b'shem Hashem Keil Oilom, that Hashem insisted that it be recognized that Hashem and world are not two separate things. That the whole mitzvah of the world is Hashem's presence. One of the big things that the Torah tells us, and Chazal explained that, what did Avraham do? That when the Arabs came to him to eat, he gave them food. And then he said, all I want from you is to thank and recognize that this food comes from Hashem. What happens if you say that? You recognize that the food comes from Hashem. What's the difference? What does Hashem care whether you thank Him or you don't thank Him? Is that something that Hashem gets benefit from it? The point there is that Avram recognized that the whole point of creating the world, that Hashem created the world, was for the sake that Hashem should be able to be recognized through the world. That was the whole point of the creation. And he set out to accomplish this task. So that now that he has Yitzchak, and Yitzchak is going to carry the banner of his avodah. In order to establish this, that Yitzchak should be able to carry this banner indefinitely, Hashem told Avram to put Yitzchak on the altar. What happens at that moment when Yitzchak was put on the altar? Up until that time, Yitzchak was Avram's son, and Avram was this great teacher in the world. And Yitzchak would be Avram's son who carries it on. Once Yitzchak was put on the altar, then Yitzchak, in effect, no longer exists as Avram's son. He was put on the altar. As far as Avram is concerned, he was ready to share. So what did Yitzchak represent after that? As we know that after the Akedah, Yitzchak was considered an Oilot Mima. He was a Kodesh, a holy man. He was not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. He had to stay in Eretz Yisrael his whole lifetime. So that in effect, by this nisoyin, by putting Yitzchak on the altar, it was a tremendous nisoyin for Abraham. But the accomplishment of this was actually the greatest thing that Abraham could have accomplished. Because thereby, Yitzchak became an actual representation of Hashem's presence in the world. Yitzchak was put on the altar. He's no longer Avram's son in the normal sense. Where does he belong? He belongs on the altar, on the Mizbeach. And that became Yitzchak's whole presence in the world, that he belongs in the altar. What is the difference between the altar? I see that you were questioning this. The altar and the rest of the world. The rest of the world is where people want, but belong to people. The altar, this is Hashem's place, right? This is the korban. What do you put on the altar? You put a korban oil and you burn it. So that means that now you took him out from amongst the living people and you put him on the altar. He's no longer part of the normal human presence. Even though he continues to live, indefinitely, and he has children, and he has a whole nation, but this nation from then on became a nation that was actually God's presence in the world, God's nation, because he was taken off the altar. He was not something that went through a natural process of, he was Avram's son and continued on in this vein. So that, in effect, this union that Avram wanted to establish in the world, the godly presence, by putting Yitzchok on the altar, he accomplished this much more, much greater depth than he could have accomplished any other way. Every other way he would have accomplished it by teaching and by doing his own thing. Here, he accomplished it because he actually gave Yitzchak away to Hashem. Completely. By Hashem's own command. Excuse me?
Was this well known? Like all around the world, people knew Yitzhak was put up there. Like it was.
It was not known at all. It was not known. But this was Yitzchak's presence in the world thereafter.
What do you mean?
He became a holy presence in the world. Not a physical presence, but a holy presence. A godly presence.
How did it change him? How did it change his state when he's going digging wells or something like that? How did it change?
When he was completely rendered, given up from living a normal life, right? He was put on the altar. If he is living thereafter, that's because Hashem chooses that he should live. Not because it's a natural process for him to live. Hashem took him down from the altar. But Mitzad Avram, he is on the altar. And as it says, really, that Yitzchok's being on the altar is always remembered. This is something which never ceases to be remembered. It's an everlasting presence that Yitzchok is on the altar. What does this mean for us? This is the primary thing that I want to discuss. Just as we discussed before regarding the surety, the clarity of vision, that it is absolutely possible for each one of us to have a clarity of vision in terms of the truth of the godly truth and the glitter of the Torah, without an iota of doubt. Similarly, in terms of our avodah, generally speaking, especially in a Baal Tshuva situation, one starts off by first recognizing a worldly presence. Recognizing the world. And what is world? World is a natural perspective. Everything happens naturally. Naturally means one thing brings about the next. There's a cause and effect. Everything has a logical sequence. Pardon me. And when I come to realize, oh, but wait a second, there is also a creator in the world, there's also God in the world. God is part of that logical sequence. Because there is a world, there has to be a God. Which means that the primary reality that we relate to is the world. That is the undisputed truth. And then we say, since I'm not a stupid man, I have intellect, I understand that this world had to be created by Hashem. We have spoken many times in the past about the Shema Yisrael. When we say Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, and we cover our eyes. Why do we cover our eyes? Right? We're trying to declare that Hashem is one in the whole world. So why do we cover our eyes? And even more than that, I was explained, you all learned that when you say Echad, you're supposed to think about the Aleph and the Ches and the Dalet. What is the Ches and the Dalet? The Ches is the up and down, the heavens and the earth, and the Dalet are the four corners of the world. In other words, the entire expanse of space. Right? And Aleph is what unites this whole space. So when you close your eyes, you don't see any space. So what's the point of closing your eyes and speak about up and down and the all four corners of the world? It would be more logical to open your eyes and start looking up and down on all four sides and say, oh, all this is all one. Instead, we say we close our eyes. What's the point? The point of this is for us to realize that even though we are used to recognizing the world because we have open eyes and we see it, we actually have a much deeper recognition of existence, not just because I see it, but even with closed eyes, there is a recognition. There is a recognition that we know the existence of the world, the existence of Hashem. We know because we have it in our soul, not because we experience it, because we're looking at it. Before we even open our eyes, we already know the truth. That's the point. We know the truth of Hashem before we even open our eyes. Not we open our eyes, we start asking, where is this coming from? Oh, it must be coming from Hashem. In this sequence, that first we know that there's a world, and then we answer the question, where it's coming from, the primary existence remains the world. That still remains the primary truth. This is the truth I'm living in. But I'm adding onto it and saying, oh, well, Hashem made it. I have to listen to Hashem because He made it. But Hashem there is a secondary. He's like an intruder. Because the simple thing that I see is the world. But what we were given as a result of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, as a result of Yitzchak being on the Akedah, we were given a holy neshama, so that we know the truth before we open our eyes. We know of Hashem's presence, of the Aleph, Ches, Dalet, with closed eyes. That is something which we can visualize, we can recognize deep down in our own mind, in our own psyche, our own neshama. Then, when we open our eyes afterwards, now I know what I can interpret and explain what this world is that I'm looking at. That's the same world I saw when I had my eyes closed. then when I'm looking at the world, it makes sense because I saw it with closed eyes. Otherwise, if I see the world only because I open eyes, that means that the world is forcing itself on me. I have to accept it as I see it. And then I have to start interpreting where is it coming from and who made it and what is it about. Regardless of what I do in terms of it in explanations, it doesn't change the simple reality that this is a world that I have to accept. But this is not the way we were made. This is not the gift that we were given. The gift that we were given is a holy neshama that we inherited from Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, where we start off our lives, start off our day, start off our conscious awareness from the opposite end, from inside out. This is why we close our eyes and we say Shema Yisrael. And we turn to see, what do I see with my eyes closed? What do I realize with my eyes closed? With my eyes closed, I realize that all existence is one. Echad. And this is the existence to which I relate, and this is the existence with which I live. Then, when I open my eyes, and I see a whole bunch of different things, I know that all of these different things belong to this very same one. And with this, I can approach doing mitzvahs and doing and learning Torah and everything, because it no longer interferes. It's not something which is against me, which interferes with me. On the contrary, this is something which I knew before I even opened my eyes. Now I have to just learn about it. This is also what it says, we mentioned it recently, that before a neshama comes down into the world, a malach comes and teaches the neshama the entire Torah. We discussed it recently. And then he forgets it all. So the question is, if he forgets it, so what's the point of having learned it? And the answer is that even though he forgot it, having learned it once, when he learns it the second time, it cleaves to him, it sticks to him more easily. He can relate to it more easily. The motion for this, to understand this, is we have our faculties, we have sight as our primary, most important faculty is sight. With sight, we have a sense of reality of the world. We see. That makes the world real to us because we see it. What happens to a person, God forbid, who doesn't see? A sightless person. So he really is in a very bad state because the world isn't real to him. He only knows what he touches. He doesn't really see the reality of the world. It's a very, very painful, very dramatic thing. What about someone who lost his sight sometime later on in life, but at one time before that he saw? So we can understand that if he saw before, even though now he doesn't see, so he's missing the sight, but still, he still knows what reality is. We already experienced it. He already had it. So even though now he doesn't see it, but still, the world is real to him because he saw it once before. So this is the similar thing. Having learned the whole Torah before being born, then the Torah when you learn is already real before you even start. And this is the same thing that we say Shema Yisrael with closed eyes. So we know the reality of the world before you even look at it. And then when we look at it and we start learning about it, it makes sense. It makes sense. It fits in with us. And we no longer feel like things are being superimposed and forced on us. Because actually, this is exactly what I saw before I even started, before I opened my eyes. This is my real view. This is my primary view. The world confuses me. The open eyes confuses me, but why I see with closed eyes, I see the reality itself, the pure reality. This is the pshat that Yitzchak was on the altar, and he became an oil tmima. He became a korban. Hashem belonged completely to Hashem before he even started. And then when he comes into the world, he comes to the world from a godly perspective, not from a worldly perspective. And this is what was imbued in each one of us, in our neshamas, that we have absolutely this capacity, this capability. This is ultimately the meaning of being a Yid. I always say, people should understand, that to learn to put on tefillin and to learn to keep Shabbos and eat kosher and all good things is very, very important. This is the easy part. This is the easy part to learn. The real challenge is to see the world from a Torah perspective, from a godly perspective. To see the world to start off as a godly world. And then we try to understand everything else. To look at the world the way I see it with closed eyes. And then open my eyes and start working with it. And not be phased, not get scared of the world. Oh, that's a real world. Don't get scared. It's the same world that you saw when the eyes were closed. It belongs to Hashem exactly the same way. Nothing changed. Now it's a challenge. Now you have to be careful how you deal with it. But it's exactly the same world. This is the truth. Hashem Echad, this is the truth. This gives us an understanding on this phenomenal thing. Hashem tells Abraham, put Yitzchak on the altar. What's going on? What's the point? What are you doing? This is not human. This is the greatest gift that Hashem has given to the Jewish people. Happened once in the history. And thereby Hashem changed the whole structure of the Jewish soul, of the Jewish person. This uplifted each one of us from being in exile, from being part of the world, to be able to lift up a bit and look at the world from the top down. To see the world from a higher perspective. What is it really about? Not to be sucked in and be lost, so to speak, in the darkness of the world. This is why We are called the light, bring light to the world. We are supposed to bring light to the world. To bring light, we have to be a little bit above it. And as we always conclude, Hashem should help each one of us to succeed in recognizing, first of all, recognizing this truth, to experience it, to have this insight, to see things from a pure perspective, recognizing the truth of God without any doubt, without an iota of doubt, and then bringing that into our lives, practical world. Instead of letting the world rule our lives, let us be the rulers of our world. So be Hatzlach.
Amen.